This is a webinar for Open Education Week 2015. My name is Jackie Hood and I'm with the Open Doors Group. We are a project of the Silicon Valley Education Foundation. So we're in Silicon Valley, which is in the northwestern part of California in the United States. And this is probably the 5th year that we have participated in Open Education Week, which is sponsored by the Open Education Consortium. And one of our former co-directors of Open Doors Group is now with the Open Education Consortium, Una Daly. So we're going to get started. I want to do a quick sound check, so if people can either speak up and say if they can hear me or type it in the chat. And of course, if you can't hear me, then you won't know I just said that. I'll type it. And I hear someone, so if your microphone is open, go ahead and speak. There's only a handful of us here. Okay, Edgar says he can hear us all the way to Brazil. Thank goodness for technology. Ian says he can hear us. So if you haven't already introduced yourself in the chat, please do that at your leisure, and then we'll have it as a record. So our topic today is business models for open education. And as Paul mentioned in the chat, a new initiative has come out that I just heard about like 2 days ago called Open Business Models. We won't be talking about that today. It's a way of sharing business models and building on them. We're going to be talking about how open education gets funded. And the purpose of the, there it goes. The goals of this webinar are not to provide pat solutions. We don't have pat solutions. So Barbara's telling people how to mute. Thank you, Barbara, for saying that. We want to stimulate the conversation. A group of us, including the 4 advisory board members of Open Doors Group and a couple of us from Open Doors Group and College Open Textbooks and Nicole Allen from Spark, have been talking since about this time last year about redefining open education. And recently a new book was published that really sort of took over and did far more than we were able to do. I think it was put out by BC Campus. So we've decided to only do one thing, and that is write a business models section for this new book on open education. I believe it's a wiki book, but I could be wrong about that. And so I will be taking notes and will be noting what's said today as the contribution into that chapter for the Open Education Wiki book. So the definition of open education is controversial. The effort I just told you about was because I challenged the Open Education Consortium. They were still called the Open Courseware Consortium this time last year. I challenged them that their definition essentially said open education and open educational resources are the same thing. And Wikipedia had distinguished fairly well between open education and open education consortium. Open education and open education resources. One of the members of the group that was meeting, Valerie Taylor, indicated that even the definition of education is controversial. And I certainly know this to be the case. When we get into these arguments about how education should proceed, we find out that one person thinks education is a way to get a job, someone else thinks it's a way to become an informed citizen, someone else thinks it's a way to become a cultured individual. And so education itself has many different definitions. And if you try to come up with a common definition, it's usually so watered down that nobody really recognizes it. And open is even more controversial. I mean, open can mean this store is open today. People can come in. And so it's quite controversial. I'm going to use a slide here from Matthew Plord, who has hoped he would be joining us today. Maybe he is one of the people that's on here. Matthew created this about massive open online courses, and his subtitle, "Every Letter is Negotiable," is very true. The open can mean open registration, it can mean open content, it can mean no cost, it can mean affordable. And of course the other three letters are also negotiable, but we're not talking about those today. So open is quite controversial. Education is controversial. But here are some of the aspects that you see in open education definitions. You talk about open admissions. That means limited need to apply, to have taken some exams, to have some prior education, to get into the course or the program, the certificate, the degree program. Here at the community college where I worked recently, you can take courses for a long time without actually going through formal admission, and then when you want a degree, you go through formal admission. Back in the 60s, when we were protesting the Vietnam War and so on, people started creating open universities that could sit under trees and there were no questions asked. You just came and learned. That's open admissions. Open credentials, the idea there is no matter where you learn something, a college or university will look at your experience and your background and your knowledge and possibly confer their credential on you, whether that be a certificate or a degree or a certification. Open pedagogy, my colleague Domitilla may be here later and she can talk a lot about open pedagogy. Open resources or open educational resources or OER, I think is well known to everyone who's on this call. And open tools primarily means open software, although with 3D printing we're now seeing open hardware, and somebody recently came up with an open house, and I don't mean in the sense of a realtor opening a house to see it, but the idea that you could get you could have access to a free design for a house and print some of it on a very large 3D printer. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, including OEC, we're defining open education as simply OER, and it's clearly much more than that. Unfortunately, a lot of times when you're talking to people about open education, they are including at least in the background of their mind that it can have this magic of no cost. And while it's true that the marginal cost of digital products is very low, just as the marginal cost of a very expensive AIDS drug is very low to make that actual little pill, there's a lot of cost behind it. So it actually is not possible to have education without cost. All education has costs. About the only form of education you could get with no cost is if you walk out the door and look at the natural world and learn things from it. And even then, you are going to have to put in, you will have to exert effort and time, and so it's going to cost you something. So both learners and educators do have costs. So what people really mean when they say no cost, what they, and let me jump ahead a couple slides, I'll come back to that one, is that the learners should provide time and effort and maybe transportation, maybe technology. There's certainly people working on the cost of technology, which to me dwarfs the cost of most courses. I'm spending a couple $100 a month on my cell phone and my internet, and then there's buying the capital equipment in the first place. But there's a strong belief that learners shouldn't have to pay for tuition, fees, and so on for learning. And it's questionable whether this is desirable. And also what the purpose of this conversation today is to talk about what kind of business models could make it possible for learners to have education without taking money out of their pocket. So I'm going to back up a little bit. So we can see technology, connectivity, transportation, but also hard dollars, pounds, euros, yen, other currency is required in most cases. For an educational institution to provide education, even if it's online, there are costs for the staff and so on. And then for the learner, typically they are going to have to take some money out of their pocket at some point for some part of their education. Unfortunately, we do get this model. It was much more common 15 years ago. Let's just all be nice and share. And there will be all these wonderful benefits if you're the author of a textbook or you've created a course and you just record it and put it up on the internet, and you'll get all this wonderful prestige and your career will get advanced. And that's really true for instructors and authors. That can be possible. Unfortunately, it takes a lot more than instructors and authors to create an education. We get people, we had a dentist who donated her book, open licensed it. It was 35 years old. It was, full of technology that had been obsoleted for a long time. Without somebody to update it, to put in new photographs, it was not particularly useful. And increasingly, as courses have gone online, we also need technologists, and technologists are expensive. They're hard to find. And you need people to fix your alphabetical order too, which I notice mine is wrong. So I need an editor, and there's two kinds of editors. There's real editors that talk about what should go into the book or the course. Instructional designers do that in the case of courses, and then there are copy editors who go in and find all your mistakes and fix them, the ones that your technology can't fix as well. And most of these people, there's only 2 people on this chart that are willing to wait for their money. And that's authors who wait and get royalties, and salespeople who wait until a textbook is sold and then they get a commission. Everybody else needs to be paid up front, and that means there needs to be capital investment. And capital is not free. You have to give a return on that investment. So here we are, a situation where education is not free. How can we make it so that the students are not paying a lot of money? And that's what the business models we're starting to look at try to address. So we've seen this slide before. And let's ask this question about whether it is desirable to have education that has no tuition or no fees. You may still have to put in effort. You may still have to drive somewhere, take a bus. You may have to have an internet connection. You may have to have a computer, but you're not paying anything for the actual content of your education. Is that desirable? Well, there's certainly some benefits to it. There will be some people who are excluded from education because they can't afford the tuition or the fees. I think more of them will be excluded for other reasons, but that's one thing. And for the vast majority of us, it is so much more convenient if we can just pull up a course and start entering it. We don't even have to put in our email address so we don't get bombarded with spam. That is very convenient. One of the reasons that people steal software, they copy it illegally, is because it's too hard to buy it. The companies make it difficult to buy it. It's not quick and convenient. You should be able to just say, okay, Sally has a copy of the software. I want a copy. 2 clicks, I own a copy. Or point your cell phone at it and you own a copy. And until that's possible, it's inconvenient to have to pay for things. You have to go find your credit card and put in all this information 5 times because they keep complaining about how you did it. So it's definitely more convenient if things are free or have no cost. The other thing, of course, is the colleges and universities are spending a tremendous amount of time and effort on processing all those payments. It's not easy to process payments, so we would have reduced administration costs and effort if there were no fees. On the negative side, people tend not to value the things they don't pay for. And we have what some people consider a problem and others consider not a problem, that we get massive numbers of people registering for massive open online courses and never even opening the course even once. So there's definitely a lack of commitment. There are other people who argue, hey, that's not a problem. It's like browsing in a bookstore or a library. And if you say the cost has to be 0 or close to 0, then the people who could afford more expensive courses are being to some extent shortchanged because there isn't enough funding to make a high-quality course. You're not going to get a Juilliard School of Music education at no cost. So those expert musicians, if we have to have everything be at the lowest possible cost, are not going to get the quality that they need and that the rest of us need to get their expertise. So these are some considerations. Nellie Deutsch is an expert on online training, especially of English as a second language. She held a couple of sessions about whether we should charge for online training or not, especially ESL. And certainly the consensus of all the people who were on the webinar, and they were by and large ESL teachers, was that they did not get a level of commitment from people who weren't paying for courses. We noticed, we did a 2,000 participant project management MOOC a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, and we noticed that our students in Africa were much more committed, and we don't know for sure, but we think one of the reasons was that they had to exert some effort to get into the course. They had to go to a cafe, they had to go somewhere to log on. The people in the first world kind of, on their lunch hour, they'd log on for a couple minutes and then they'd leave. So we really think when you have a little, what we call skin in the game, you tend to be a little bit more committed. So I want to digress for a minute. If you don't have a business degree, you may not have studied business models at all. Here's a couple of really good reports. They're dated. They're a few years old, but I haven't seen anything better recently. This 40-some page paper from the MIT Sloan School of Management about business models has a wonderful chart on page 34. It's in the appendix. It shows 16 possible business models and shows 7 of them that are the most viable. And you can imagine what they are. I mean, people produce manufactured goods. Rents is any kind of renting anything is a business model, and so on. And then Michael Rapp, I think he's at the University of North Carolina. He did a really excellent paper on business models on the web, and has some great examples of all the the Amazons and the eBays and Wall Street Journal and all the various models on the web. So those are, if you're not familiar with business models, I definitely recommend those. Just Google those terms. You'll find those 2 papers immediately.
Okay. Alana brought some cat food for us. You want to put that? Alana brought some cat food to pass on to us. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this is the dry one, but it's the special dry one. Yeah. It's a big bag of it. Yeah.
So Ian, can you speak up or type what you're saying in the chat? I can tell you're speaking.
Only when you're passing by.
I think he's talking to someone, okay, not to us.
You want me to wait out in front of the library? In 5 minutes. Okay, bye.
Okay. He was on a phone call. I thought he was trying to say something about business models. And I'm going to give you all plenty of chance to talk in a few minutes. And if Ian takes another call, I'll mute him. Yeah, I think he stopped, Barbara. I hate to mute people, and I got in trouble with one of my bosses for muting him, so I try to avoid that. I want them to mute themselves. But if he talks again, I will mute him. Okay, thanks, Ian. So can you mute yourself, Ian, if you talk again, and if not, I will mute you. Okay, one of the things that I want to point out is that there is not going to be one business model for open education. There will be a lot of different business models, just like there are a lot of business models in the economies as a whole. We're going to look at 4 kinds of business models in the next few minutes. There are probably many others, but these are some that have been suggested. And, well, we'll just do that. But we don't think there will be one answer. None of us would like to see only one kind of world. For some reason, my arrow keys don't work. I have to use the mouse. So here's third-party business models, and they're interesting. They have some disadvantages. A third-party business model, as one person put it, is a business model in which, as in the case of veterinary medicine, the critter that's paying is not the critter who benefits. Now, of course, the person who's paying, or the organization who's paying, obviously sees some benefit to doing this, or they wouldn't do it. Advertisers, for example, pay for things to be delivered. They pay for a glossy magazine to get to you, a television program. But they see that, they hope that you will then go and buy their products. So they do get an indirect benefit, but the direct benefit of the thing that's being produced does not go to the advertiser. It goes to the consumer. Then the consumer doesn't have to pay for the whatever it is, whether it's an internet website or all of Google, all of Facebook, they're all based on an advertising business model. Another third-party business model is insurance. Obviously, the consumer is paying for insurance in some cases, but in the case of employer-provided insurance or government-provided insurance, the person paying is not the person who's getting the direct benefit. And insurance is a good model because it says that the people who have big problems, car wrecks, or they die, they get money and the others get peace of mind. The people who don't have a car wreck, the people who don't get a bad disease, they buy peace of mind. But in the end, they're paying far more than the cash benefit they get. So insurance is sort of a quasi third-party model. Philanthropy is another third-party model. A foundation or an individual is donating money so that someone else can get some service or good, and the philanthropist gets, a good feeling, or the world becomes a better place for them. Taxation is a mixed benefit. Again, you pay taxes, you get to use the roads, you get to have contracts enforced and so on. But you don't pay exactly, it isn't a fee-for-service basis. And you may have voted against that tax, but you still have to pay it. So it's a quasi-third. Now, textbooks are a whole different model, and I haven't even tried to put it on here, where the professor chooses the textbook, the student both pays for it and uses it, but he doesn't get to choose it. So and it's been referred to as a broken market because it's so very strange. So third-party business models have some difficulties. They will always be around. The consumer has less choice than they would if they were just purchasing. They get this newspaper that's full of ads, and maybe some of the ads appeal to them, some of them don't. Maybe the content isn't exactly what they want, but they are willing to take that lack of choice because they're not having to pay any money for this. With the internet advertising supported tools like Google and Facebook, there's a lot of controversy about the fact that not only are these organizations putting ads in front of us, they're tracking what we do in order to put the most appropriate ads in front of us. We worry about our private information being sold to other organizations. We get really tired of spam. So privacy issues are another problem with third party. The payers themselves, as I mentioned, they get an indirect benefit, but as people say, you know that 10% of your advertising does good, you just don't know which 10% it is. And while there are newer and newer tools to help you understand how your advertising dollars are spent and which ones perform well, which ones don't, it's still a little bit less certain than the person who's at the corner grocery store knows exactly which vegetables sell and which ones don't. And I have to move my GoToMeeting so I can see my last bullet. And with taxes, I mean, people talk about it being majority rule, but very few taxes are passed by a majority, because typically in any geographical area, a lot of people are not allowed to vote, and many people do not vote. And then only typically half of the people who vote for a particular tax. And in some cases, actually in some cases you do have to have 2/3 or more to vote. So not everyone who pays taxes has voted for those taxes. And there are fines and even imprisonment if you don't pay your taxes. The philanthropy business model that's been emerging with a lot of foundations is that they will pay for capital investment. They'll build a building for your home, for your low-income housing, or your homeless shelter, or your meals. but they want to see your operations be self-sustaining. This is an argument, for example, for the high-speed rail system that's being proposed in California. Is this high-speed rail is one of the few mass transportation systems in which the fares that are charged actually do pay for the ongoing operation. The tax money only needs to go for the investment. So if we took this over to education, what this would say is that grants or donations should pay for a course to be created in the first place. And this is one of the ways that the National Repository of Open Courseware, operated by the University of California, works, is they get grants from the big foundations to create a course, and then they have subscriptions that take care of the maintenance of that course and the updating of that course and the distribution of that course. So that's a fairly typical philanthropy model. If operations generate no revenue at all, there are no subscriptions, there are no fees, then you have an unusual situation because foundations typically do not want to commit to ongoing revenue. And so using a philanthropy business model has some difficulties with education. Tiered pricing models are extremely interesting. 200 years ago, the average doctor would provide medical care at a fee to most of their patients, and then on Saturday they would take charity patients that they didn't charge a fee to. There are some medical clinics that charge an amount for it. There are some in India that do eye operations, and they charge a very low fee for eye operations, but there are some of their patients that they don't charge anything for them but those kinds of tiered pricing are typically 90-10, 90%, 10%. However, with digital content or something like pharmaceuticals, it's actually possible to reverse that and have 10% of the customers pay and the other 90% get a free ride. So you have a lot of business models on the web where the low-level product is free and then people can upgrade and get a more expensive product, and that those few who upgrade are subsidizing the 90% who don't pay. This book called Free is very, very interesting and has lots and lots of examples of this type of pricing where just a very small amount of money, a very small number of customers paying can subsidize all the rest of them. How did I get airlines in there twice? I'm not sure, but airlines definitely do tiered pricing. You may be sitting next to someone who paid 5 times as much for their seat as you did, or vice versa. And other types of transportation and even hotels and so on do this as well. And you pay extra for convenience or in some cases just a little more leg room or something like that. But it's definitely tiered pricing. And if airlines were forced to charge everybody exactly the same price, then there would be a lot of people who would be priced out of travel because there wouldn't be those higher fees to subsidize them. Now, can we use tiered pricing models to create no tuition, no fee education for billions of people? And the goal of most people in open education is to get to the point where 4 or 5 billion people out of the 7 or 8 billion in the world can get an education. There's a real challenge with the last couple of billion who don't have access to the technology. We would certainly have to get to the point where education could be automated to the state of a nearly zero marginal cost, which is what's the case with many of these internet offerings that go with the tiered pricing. There's a question, however, this would be a world of MOOCs, okay, whether that's really a good education or not. There's certainly a lot of people who believe that the best education is one-on-one with a trainer, a tutor, a teacher working with the learner. And that kind of level of automation does not allow for that type of one-on-one labor-intensive education and training. Clearly it can subsidize that to a great extent, But getting to the point where we can actually provide a person with the kind of education you got when you sat down with your piano teacher on her piano bench and learned how to play, we're not envisioning that in our technology. Maybe someday robots, something could make it possible to have both very, very low marginal cost and that type of one-on-one experience. And it's certainly a model that we can use for some kinds of education. I mentioned the National Repository of Open Courseware. It does use that model. The content is free to teachers and students, but institutions have to pay, and that subsidizes the free part. Another model that's brought up a lot is open source software, and open source software has been very successful in some areas. More than half the internet runs on an open source internet operating system. We have servers running on Linux. We have the Mozilla browser and other Mozilla products. They're all open source. I work with a company called WSO2, and they compete fairly effectively with IBM for middleware for large computers using an open source model. However, it's not a perfect model. Apple is the biggest company in the world, not just the biggest computer company, the biggest company in the world in terms of capitalization, twice as big as the next largest company, and they do not use open source, and they do not advocate open source. Most of their operating systems and software are very proprietary. IBM and Red Hat do advocate and support Linux and other open source software, but they support it on a model that says that the source is open source, but the support costs money. So does WSO2. And they do a lot of the fixes on Linux. It's not this people out in the world sharing and putting in hours and hours. I've watched some amazing things on Linux. Somebody will propose on a Friday that we need to do a bug fix release, and by Monday it's done, with hundreds of volunteers from around the world doing it. It'd be almost impossible in a commercial software in a company. On the other hand, when you really look at the demographics of the people working on software and the kind of work that needs to be done on software, it's a very homogeneous group of programmers. There's not all these other people that we talked about earlier, the illustrators, the technologists. There probably should be. There should be technical writers and things like that. But by and large, it's a homogeneous group, and many of the people working on open source software are contractors and consultants who do it to boost their own expertise. So there is a difference between open source software and open educational resources, business models, content, everything else. We can use some of what open source software used for open education, but not all of it. And of course, we can also use open source software itself in open education. So another fairly common model is, especially for textbooks and open educational resources, is that the tools will be free online, but if you want a paper-bound version of a textbook or you want added services, you pay for those. Unfortunately, paper is needed most by the most disadvantaged. Any educational resources in many parts of Africa end up on paper. People just do not have the technology, the connectivity. I've talked to instructors in Africa who say, I log on, I start to do a download, I go give a lecture. If I come back, I'm lucky if the download has happened. So paper's needed in those places, and so to say you who need paper must pay, whereas those who can afford the internet don't pay, seems like exactly backwards of what we want to do. It also applies, as we talked earlier about one-on-one training and teaching, applies primarily to resources, including videos of lectures and so on, but not so much to the one-on-one feedback, coaching, mentoring. That makes for really high-class education. Also, in general, open resources do not carry with them credentials. And so for that definition of education that says education is to get a credential, this is going to fall short of providing them with the means to get employment or promotions or get into graduate school and so on. Also, paper itself is not the best resource because people like to learn also from video and from audio, and they like to interact, and that's hard to do with, you can do it with paper, with workbooks and so on, but it's less easy. Also, I think this is interesting. In 2010, the student PIRGs and also I believe Pearson did studies asking primarily millennials whether they preferred bound textbooks or online textbooks. And at that time, I think that the student PIRGs number was 75% preferred bound textbooks, and Pearson's was 77%. But my husband found a study the other day that said it has dropped to 25%. I think that's amazing. We've all been waiting for the big jump, the chasm in which more people would prefer online. I think the handheld devices have made a difference. The tools, the tools that you use to read textbooks have improved a lot. But we're still going to see some preference for paper. And it was interesting in that same article that one of the students said, it listed one of her objections to paper textbooks was that she spends more time with them because she reads more of it than she does. She just scans it when it's online, which is perhaps an argument that it would be better to have paper. The model failed for Flat World Knowledge. They thought they could give the content away and then have enough people buy either the bound textbooks or the support, and they had to back off from that. Bill Buxton's company, well, I mentioned OpenStax and Saylor. They both are getting ongoing subsidies. Bill's company, Bill Buxton's company, is called, it's not, I'm losing it for a minute, I'll think of it later, but he's still doing it, that he provides the textbooks free online and then charges for the paper one. And he won a business model contest at Santa Clara University with that model. It's called Textbook Equity is the name of Bill's company. So they're still moving ahead, but as I mentioned earlier, philanthropists typically do not want to have this ongoing subsidy. They would like to see operations pay for the ongoing, and then they do the capital investment. Okay, I think we're almost to the point. We got one more to look at, and then we'll get to some discussion. It's a little, I've taken more time than I had intended to. So here's a couple of some interesting models, and they're not specifically to education, but they can be applied. One of them is, the other three could be applied to education. The one that is specific to education, very interesting book about a gentleman who, like many people, believe that public tax-supported schools, and we're talking K-12 here, were the way to go. But the more he traveled, the more he saw for-profit schools run by poor people for poor people were doing a much better job. People who would not send their kids to the public schools because the teachers didn't show up, the schools weren't safe, and they would spend a little bit of money to send their kids to a for-profit school. And these for-profit schools would in turn, like we talked about earlier, if there were students who couldn't pay at all, they'd let them in, or they'd let them in at a reduced rate. A very interesting book, fascinating book to read. And he studied both Africa and India, so I encourage you to read that book. The other models you've probably heard of, one is called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, and it's also related to the classic book by Clayton Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma. So I'm going to talk a minute about The Innovator's Dilemma and then move into The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. The innovator's dilemma is that big companies listen to their customers as they're taught to do in their business schools, and their customers always say bigger, faster. As Henry Ford said, if I'd asked the customers, they would have said, I want faster horses, not I want horseless carriages. So the two examples that Christensen uses in his books, one of them is steam shovels. You go to the big construction companies, they were called steam shovels in those days, big diggers. Big diggers. And these construction companies would say, we want even bigger diggers, 35 feet across. But this little company invented these tiny little diggers called bobcats. And they just took off, And the big companies would never have considered doing this because they could be used in all kinds of inconvenient places. And then they moved up market. The other example Christensen used were disk drives. You go and ask IBM and other big companies what kind of disk drives you want, bigger, faster. And yet companies came along and invented smaller, less good disk drives and put them in place. My own example, which was not in Christensen's book, used to work on project management software, did a guide to project management software, and the programs were humongous, and they ran on mainframes. And then here came a product Mac project for the Macintoshes and Microsoft project, and they were really clunky and awful, but they were so cheap. They weren't $100,000, so people would buy them, and then they moved up market and they pushed the big guys out. Another example is shoes. The rich used to have custom-made shoes. The poor had cast-offs. Then people started manufacturing shoes, and the rich wouldn't even look at them, but the manufactured shoes got better and better till eventually almost all of us buy manufactured shoes. Even probably Queen Elizabeth probably buys manufactured shoes and not custom-made ones. So that's the idea of the innovator's dilemma, is that things that are geared to be not so good, not so great, but very inexpensive come into the market and they crowd out the expensive things. The fortune at the bottom of the pyramid said we absolutely have to apply all of our technology and knowledge and creative skill to manufacturing products for the poorest of the poor, people who live on $1 a day or less. And the innovations have been amazing that have come out. Some of you have probably seen the TED video about the incubator that's a couple $100 versus $20,000 for an incubator used in Western hospitals. And this $200 incubator, it's still too expensive for the mothers themselves to afford in the poorest countries, but it's possible for social service agencies to buy hundreds of these incubators when they couldn't do that with the $20,000 incubator. So that's the idea of the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. Apply, get really good products that are geared to be built at very tiny prices, and then they will move up market as well, and everybody will buy them at this cheaper price. Microloans allow people like the people building schools to put together enough capital to create a market in their village. And typically this is Grambling Bank, and if you haven't read about microloans, I encourage you to do that. So these are some ideas that would bring the poor into the world economy, would eventually be self-supporting, and would not require the capital investment from taxation or from philanthropy. Okay, so we have a big conversation going on in the chat, and I have not had a chance to look at it because I was talking, and I can't microprocess. So I'm going to go and look at the chat. In the meantime, people feel comfortable adding to the chat. I'm going to see what people have said, and I want to welcome the people who've joined recently. So Barbara says she can only be here till 4:50, so I'm going to jump to the last slide and then come back. I wanted to mention that Barbara has been an advisor to Open Doors Group for several years. Open Doors Group is College Open Textbooks is splitting off from Open Doors Group, and Barbara's going with College Open Textbooks and is their first advisory board member. That just happened in the last few weeks. And Dami is here, Domitilla Enders, from Open Assembly is here. Robin Donaldson is another advisory board member, and she hasn't actually decided whether she's going to be with College Open Textbooks or Open Doors Group. Barbara, did you want to say anything before you leave? Maybe you're already gone.
No, I'm not already gone. I'm still here and following the really fascinating discussion between Wayne, Dami, and Cable in the chat room. But just want to thank you for doing the webinar.
Okay. Well, thanks, Barbara. We're going to go back to the discussion. And if any of you want to speak up, go ahead and do so. And I'm going to be tracking through the discussion, see if I can summarize it for people. I do know that people have been talking about the open business models, which I just heard about a couple days ago, which I think is more of a way of sharing business models than it is about business models to fund open education, but I could be wrong. And some of you, Wayne, Paul, if you want to speak up about it, please go ahead and do so. Okay, Paul says he's with Creative Commons, and I'm sure most of you know, but Creative Commons is one of the ways to open license resources, materials, films, videos, music. Barbara introduced herself as being with OpenStax College, and she wrote an open textbook. She's also with De Anza College. She's a math professor at De Anza College.
I'll say one more thing. Yes, my textbook, the textbook that I co-authored, is published by OpenStax. I'm not an OpenStax employee. I'm at De Anza College, and I just want to encourage lots of people to join these Open Ed Week webinars, because there are so many wonderful ones. But also, if you're able to get to Banff for the Open Ed Consortium, that's a 3-day in-person meeting in April, and I know Dami's presenting, I'm presenting, probably either Cable or Paul, I don't remember which one of them, or both of them, and that's another way to meet up with people in person. But I really appreciate, Jackie, you doing the webinar here.
Thank you, Barbara. So I'm getting past the places where people just say whether they can hear or not hear and so on. And so Wayne has commented, and for those of you who don't know, Wayne is with WikiEducator in, I believe, New Zealand and around the world. And Wayne commented that most of us working in the free culture seem to know what open means. We just get the job done. Okay. Barbara concurred with that. And Wayne says most of the cost is sunk cost. Wayne, can you explain that a little bit by what you mean by sunk cost? Maybe he's gone. Let me check. Or muted. Yeah, he's muted. One of the things we're quite used to is a economic fallacy called, I think it's something like sunk costs. Like, we can't quit this project because we've already spent so much on it, even if it's never going to meet its objectives. That's called you have to ignore what's happened in the past and move forward, see what it's going to cost to move forward from that point. And so Wayne is saying a significant component of public funded education system is paid by taxpayer dollars. Why should learners pay twice for their materials? Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand it, because as I understand it, most taxpayer-funded institutions have 3 or 4 sources of revenue. One is taxes, one is tuition and fees, another is their donations from their alumni, and in some cases their college is sitting on an oil well, so they have some money from that. They get some money from research. But if any one of those sources of money went away, they wouldn't have enough money to fund what they're doing. So I don't think there's any paying twice and any extra money flowing around. Now, some of the states in the U.S. are starting to cut back. I think Colorado has said they will eventually not fund higher education at all. And of course, K-12 in the U.S. is funded through taxation in general, but there are private schools as well. Now, those people do pay twice. The people who pay for public courses, public education, and send their kids to private school, they are paying twice. Wayne comments, tertiary education, which is we call higher education, was free in New Zealand. He didn't hear faculty complaining about the lack of commitment or lower quality. Okay, I think that's a really good point. I think if a student goes to a college, they get admitted, they perhaps live there, and they're working for a certificate or a degree, they may very well be very committed even though they're not paying tuition or fees. So that's much more true of the more casual MOOCs and videos and so on the web than it is of someone who's putting something in. I mentioned our project management course, that while the people in Africa were not paying for the course, they were having to invest some extra effort to log on, and so they stayed on longer and did more work than the people in North America and Europe. And Wayne says he values his open source operating system every day. Wayne, do you donate? I donate to TinyURL. I donate occasionally to some of the other, to Wikipedia. But I know if they had to rely on my donations, they would certainly not survive. Wayne says he grew up in Africa. Not sure, assumption about the reasons to learn align with what's happening on the ground. Okay. Wayne, I really hope you can come on and explain these a little more, because I have no idea what you mean by that one. Okay, and Paul's making the same statement. I lived in Germany for a while, and you could go to higher ed at no cost. The way the system works there is you read a subject. That means you take lectures and you read textbooks. And then when you're ready to get a degree, you apply and take an exam to get the degree. And eventually they finally decided that people 30 years of age or older would have to pay tuition because they were hanging around the universities taking up spaces that younger people needed. So yeah, I guess that you guys all have a point. It is possible. I mean, a lot of us worked very, very hard in grade school and high school, and we weren't paying, and our parents weren't paying, other than just the costs of things like, gym clothes and stuff like that, but we weren't paying tuition or fees. The much more applies to the massive courses online. Okay, so Cable's comment is at the Open Policy Network, we advocate that all publicly funded education and research should be open licensed by default, CC BY, yes, and that's been a major initiative of Creative Commons and other organizations. My concern is that eventually that could mean that people would push for more and more taxpayer funded research and so on, and there wouldn't be much competition. And I'm always worried about government control and government dictates on education, and lack of competition, lack of variety.
Jackie, can you hear me?
Yes, but I can't tell who's speaking, so please introduce yourself.
Sorry, it's me. It's Cable.
Oh, now I recognize your voice.
So I think that my point there would be that open policies are not about the government competing with, say, a market or reducing competition, et cetera, but rather, so there's sort of two decision points. Decision point number one is, should government fund X? So, should the government be in the business of funding research to cure cancer? Should government fund research for better solar cell efficiency, right? Those are all policy decisions, and whether or not the government should fund something is the first question. Open policy stays silent on that question. That's a policy discussion for the public to have with its government. But what open policy says is, once the government makes the decision to fund something, so if the National Institutes of Health does decide it wants to fund research around curing cancer, if the National Science Foundation does decide that in order for us to be competitive in green technologies, that we need new academic programs in universities to teach STEM or whatever it might be. Once those decisions have been made, open policy simply says if the public's paying for something, that those resources should be openly licensed. And of course, those grants are open and competitive, so anybody can apply. And certainly the advocacy that we put forward is that those grants should be open to all parties, including commercial textbook publishers. So another good example would be the K-12 OER Collaborative, where the states are coming together and are funding along with foundations initially, but then the states paying the ongoing maintenance, the production of high-quality open educational resources for K-12 curriculum, including textbooks. And the states are not saying this has to be produced by nonprofits, et cetera. The states are saying, look, we don't care who builds it. Pearson could build it, McGraw-Hill could build it. What we're going to require is a more efficient and more effective business model with, or not business model, a more effective production with public funds. And so we, the states, will hold the copyright. The producers of the work will be work for hire. They will put us, or we will put a CC BY license on what we build, and we will share it with everybody. So I think it's a mistake to kind of commingle open policy with the decisions of whether or not government should do something. I see those as two different things.
I think those are very good inputs, Cable. I'm not sure how it translates. I mean, it's perfect for OER. I have a hard time getting it to go to the wider screen of open education, of how people get credentials and get one-on-one teaching and so on from that. Again, OER, yes. So Wayne has commented that education is not advertising, insurance, etc. Why use those models? First of all, we can do education with advertising. In fact, we do a lot of it on the web. An incredible amount of the education, training, videos, and so on the web are sponsored through advertising, one way or another through advertising, so it is appropriate. Insurance, there have been insurance policies sold, but I mean the bottom line is when you study business, you look at thousands of businesses and then you come up with models that can work. A few models with Sloan, it was 16. With Michael Rappa, it was 20. I mean, that's just the way we do abstract thinking, is we look at models and we see where they work and where they don't. Advertising doesn't work for agriculture. I think third-party business models, the third-party business models that apply in education are primarily taxation and philanthropy. Those are the two third-party business models that apply. I think there is some room for insurance and advertising as slight alternatives to that.
So Jackie, could I jump in and sort of
Sure.
clarify a few of my thoughts?
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, I think the point I'm making is not so much around the specifics of the examples, but rather to say that a publicly funded education system is not a perfect economy in the sense that you would view a normal entrepreneurial operation. And so every time we try and import a business model that is designed for a traditional sort of economy that behaves under a perfect economy or the rules of a perfect economy, there are a number of very material risks. I mean, we know that the traditional rules of economics do not apply to tertiary education because we have unsatisfied demand the world over, and we are not seeing prices drop. So that tells us that sort of these principles of importing business models that are designed for different purposes are not good for investment in the public good. They don't work. The risk of advertising, of course, is you give Coca-Cola a contract to have vending machines on campus at the expense of not allowing Pepsi, onto campus, and there are a whole range of social issues that come with that. I mean, for example, in our networks, we do not tolerate advertising at all for those very reasons. But I think Cable made an excellent point late in the conversation, specifically that we already have a sustainable model. A government funds tertiary education. if we have open licenses, we will have an open education model. And to speak to your point around the credentialing, there are international networks around the world who will credential learning towards credible degrees using open education courses based solely on open education, and it's a perfectly sustainable model. So just a few thoughts from my perspective and experiences in this part of the world. It may not be true in the US. I'm not an expert in the economics of the US higher education system, but having worked across 50 Commonwealth countries, that would sort of reflect my experience in those countries.
So just a couple quick comments. First of all, business models usually include models like taxation, even robbery and illegal means are considered business models. The mafia has a business model. The Catholic Church has a business model. It doesn't have to be a commercial organization to have a business model. We also, even families and tribes have business models of sort. As how do you exchange goods and services, whether it barter, other things. So business models do apply to more than just business. And it was interesting you made the comment that there's a lot more.
Why is it called a business model? Why is it called a business model if it doesn't apply to business?
We could change it. We could call it exchange model, okay, something like that. It's just the term that's been accepted. My language teachers would say it's an idiom, so let's move on. The other thing is your comment about there's unsatisfied demand. There are people saying that there's a lot of evidence that we are overeducated as a society. A lot of education that we receive, we never use again. Many people don't want the education. One person's definition of education was you have to take at least one course you didn't want to take. That's the definition of an education. But I think a lot of us take a lot of education that we never used, never wanted, and that has to do with mandatory attendance in school and so on. So I think it's a really big debate about whether the world is undereducated or overeducated. I'm sure there's a little bit of both in many places. So just those are my comments, and I think your points are well taken. I don't think we have a model that's working well for everyone in the world. Tertiary education being government funded, many people never get to that point. So, and there's even doubt about whether we really need tertiary education for everybody. So there's much room there for debate. Let me real quickly, we're on the hour, and I'm sure you all have other things to run to. I'm just going to real quickly see if there were any other comments in the chat that we need to bring up here to be on the recording. Dami said, so she's talking with Wayne about non-rivalrous goods like OER, okay, and you agreed with her there. Running on OSS, yeah, so I was talking about iPhones and iPads and things like that. It doesn't have to be the internet. I could have been, talking about General Motors is just an example of a proprietary company that has done extremely well, and that open source does well, but not that good, not that well. Okay, Flat World Knowledge was not Open Libra, no wonder it failed. Okay, well that's interesting. And people who argue that NROC is not really open either, but that's when you get down into the open definitions. Okay, so thank you all. I will publish I'll talk to Igor and others at OEC and find out how we publish this recording and the chat. By all means, contact us. We will get your ideas into this chapter of the Wikibook. We'll get as many ideas as we can, and I appreciate your attendance. Please, someone says generalizations don't work. Well, I think that means our education doesn't work because it's all based around generalizations. If we had to do everything specific, we'd have a hard time classifying plants and animals, for example. Okay, thank you all. I'm going to end the recording. I really appreciate your attendance and your comments. Have a good evening.